If you're a filmmaker, there is a question everyone asks you which is impossible to answer. What is your favorite film of all time? I've always found this question strange. It seems to me that any person off the street would have a quick answer to this, but cinephiles and filmmakers will find creative ways to avoid commitment to one film for fear that they might somehow slight the rest of their top 10 list.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What are you talking about, huh?
In this way, I've previously found it easier to provide a short list of directors whose films would populate my top 25, if I was even able to be decisive enough to narrow it down that far. When discussing my favorite directors, there's one name I never forget to mention: Paul Thomas Anderson. I happened to come across the majority of his films around the same time that I decided to become a filmmaker. I'm sure this has aided his meteoric rise to the top of my list. Despite my personal bias, I would argue that Paul Thomas Anderson is one of the best working filmmakers today. To return to the original question, if Anderson is my favorite director, whether it be for sentimental or objective reasons, well then which of his films is my favorite? That is also a difficult question. I always find whichever I'm currently watching becomes my favorite for that time. However, there may be one frontrunner if I tried to choose which of his is the best. That film would be There Will Be Blood. There Will Be Blood is a 2007 film loosely based on the book Oil by Upton Sinclair, as well as stories about California oil tycoon Edward Doheny. So it can be inferred that Anderson is expressing a similar point of view in this work. One of the locations they used later in this film was the real-life mansion of Doheny himself, which can also be recognized as Mr. Lebowski's mansion in The Big Lebowski.
Or his dudeness, or Duder, or El Duderino, if you're not into the whole brevity thing.
Many, including Anderson himself, have pointed out the influence of John Huston's The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which, if you haven't seen, I recommend highly. The influence can definitely be felt in the film's presentation and landscape. As with all our other Essential Art House videos, I don't want to spoil the plot too much. There Will Be Blood tells the story of Daniel Plainview, a ruthless capitalist in pursuit of riches, domination, and, as he says himself, isolation from other people. In one of our first glimpses at this man, he crawls across miles of California desert with a broken leg. This image, presented at the beginning of the film, is our template for all his other character actions. This act serves as his defining characteristic, and it shapes our understanding of what he's capable of and how driven he is. He's a determined, unstoppable force of human nature. This film is one of the best character studies of all time, and probably one of the best performances by a lead actor that I can think of. His performance in this film actually might just be my favorite by any actor in any film. Every time I watch it, I notice other small details.
I'm a family man. I run a family business. This is my son and my partner, H.W. Plainview. We offer you the bond of family that very few oil men can understand.
Despite the fact that Day-Lewis steals the show, the supporting cast is also impressive. Paul Dano gives one of his best, if not his best performance of his career as a charlatan preacher who acts as an antagonist to Day-Lewis's Plainview.
Out, devil! Out, sin! Do you accept the church of the third revelation as your spiritual guide? Get out of here! Get out of here! Get out of this! Do you accept Jesus Christ as your Savior?
Yes, I do.
A unique twist on the protagonist-antagonist relationship, this film paints these two men negatively in equal measure, and even implies they have similarities in the way they use and manipulate people for personal and economic gain. Not only does this film excel in storytelling, character development, and acting, but the cinematography and music are some of the best I've ever seen. The cinematography is about as analog as possible. It's entirely shot on film, utilizes some vintage lenses, and for one shot of Plainview and his infant son riding on a train, they even use a vintage 1910 Pathé camera. Many films, whether they're shot on film or digitally, are color graded in post-production, but that isn't the case for There Will Be Blood. Supposedly they even printed all their dailies on film, meaning there were no digital prints of their footage. Paul Thomas Anderson has said he doesn't like digital intermediates because it offers too many options. He prefers the equipment's personality come through. Many have called Anderson a film purist, among the company of other modern directors who prefer doing things the old-fashioned way, like Wes Anderson, Christopher Nolan, Quentin Tarantino, and even George Lucas. The score by Radiohead's Jonny Greenwood is potentially my favorite film score of all time. It feels raw, eerie, and extremely unsettling. It's entirely goosebump-inducing. It almost feels like it could be placed into a psychological thriller or a horror film and no one would notice. I even read that Anderson thinks of Day-Lewis's Plainview as being somewhat Dracula-esque. It's hard for me to not speak hyperbolically about this film because of how much I like it. I always worry about overhyping something right before someone watches, but I imagine most will have a hard time arguing that the writing, directing, acting, cinematography, editing, costumes, score, or anything else in the film are less than exceptional. There are a lot of reasons I think this film very well may be my favorite of all time. Given that, don't just assume that I think this film is essential because I like it, but rather that the film's merits themselves warrant its status as an essential art house film.